then Art said to me, it's common knowledge that they're queer, that they're fairies. Those are the terms used in those days. But he said, we don't talk about it.
Whether we like it or not, it's always been true that a public man's private sex life makes him vulnerable. Hoover knew this. He would eventually seek out one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in Washington to ask for advice and help because he was so terrorized by his own sexuality. What was he, as director of the FBI, to do about these urges that he had?
In Washington, D.C., police detectives were picking up intelligence about Hoover's private life.
Guy Hoddle was a retired or fired agent. He was an alcoholic. And Hoddle would, every time he had a few drinks, he would tell stories about parties that went on in J. Edgar Hoover's house when that there were sex parties there. No girls. So when you say sex parties, what does that mean if you have no girls?
I remember Ash Resnick at the Caesar's Palace. He used to be the manager of the nightclub there. He told me that Meyer Lansky had some pretty strong evidence that Hoover and Tolson were both homosexuals.
When he was asked what that meant, he said that Lansky had obtained photographs of Hoover in a compromising situation with Clyde Tolson.
One man who actually claims to have seen such photographs is Gordon Novell, a controversial figure with connections to the intelligence community. Novell, who had worked for the White House in the early 1960s, became involved in a complicated legal action which the White House wanted him to pursue, but which Hoover wanted dropped.
So I went to the White House, and the White House sent me to Mr. Angleton, Director of Counterintelligence, CIA. We met in a restaurant, and I told him my problem, and he says, I know what your problem is. He said, you need to tell Mr. Hoover that you've met with me and that you're not going to dismiss the lawsuit and that you've seen this. At which point he opened up his briefcase and pulled out a couple of photographs of Mr. Hoover in flagrante delicto, I guess is one way to describe it. Having oral sex.
This testimony does not stand alone. I talked to a former regular officer in the OSS, that's the predecessor of the CIA, who said that after the war, he went to dinner with other OSS American intelligence colleagues, and that after dinner, when over the brandy stage, when conversation turned to the private lives of public people, his host went out of the room and then came back with a photograph. And this was passed around the table, and the photograph showed two men, Hoover and Tolson, engaged in homosexual activity.
In New Orleans, where the CIA and the Mafia had sometimes collaborated, Mafia Don Carlos Marcello told Gordon Novell that he too had seen a photograph.
I had volunteered the information that I had seen a picture of Mr. Hoover in performing oral sex, and he said that he had seen it too, and that had been used to keep the FBI, but not the Justice Department, off the back of the mob.
Meyer Lansky had some pretty heavy stuff on Hoover, that he was a homosexual, without any question. And he'd shove it to him if he ever had to.
Irving Resnick said Lansky was the guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made his deal with Hoover to lay off. That was the reason that for a long time we had nothing to fear from the FBI.
In the 40s, we hardly touched organized crime because the Bureau did not believe that there was a mafia, or did not allow us to investigate the mafia as such.
For the vital decades of the Mafia's growth, Hoover denied that nationally syndicated organized crime existed and ignored all evidence that it did.
There wasn't one mention of the Mafia. There wasn't one mention of organized crime activities during the training course that I and all other brand new FBI agents went through in Washington. Not one mention of it.
In fact, the Bureau in Washington had no organized crime division. When I went to the supervisor in Seattle and asked why we weren't going after the mafia, he said, "We don't use that word. Hoover doesn't acknowledge that there's a mafia."
Mr. Kennedy, do you expect to delve into any particular fields when you take over as Attorney General?
Well, I think that there are a number of different areas and where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Before the Kennedys, the mob had literally been getting away with murder.
The glory years for the mob were right after the Second World War, right up to 1960. That was it.
Nick Pileggi has written about the mob for 30 years and was co-author of the movie Goodfellas.
They owned politicians. They owned unions. They could actually socialize. The FBI said they didn't exist. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was glorious.
Now, would you explain what fading a place means? Well,
Jack and Robert Kennedy had studied the mob since 1957, when they took the lead on the McClellan Committee's investigation of organized crime and its association with organized labor. They focused on Jimmy Hoffa, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the largest union in the country. They were quick to clash.
I would like to say, Senator, that if you're trying to penalize the American labor movement for Hoffa, or for your dislike for Hoffa, then spell it out in the law, exempting everybody except Hoffa. Will you please?
Well, we're exempting everyone but racketeers and hoodlums and crooks.
I would like to have you draft that language, sir.
I'm not talking necessarily...
As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was determined to convert his knowledge of the mob into a new national policy. Don't define it. Do something about it, he told the young lawyers he recruited for this mission. Robert Blakey was one of those lawyers.
You just can't know how inefficient and complicated and inept the government is unless it's held together in some way by the force of somebody's personality. Robert Kennedy had that and did that.
He forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to shift manpower and resources away from hunting communists to busting gangsters. He surfaced mob informant Joe Valachi in a nationally televised hearing.
Then he picks your finger. Who? The Godfather.
He picks your finger.
He picks your finger with a needle. Makes a little blood come out. In other words, that's the express to blood relation. Supposed to be like brothers.
That's the letting of blood.
That's right.
All of us in that position.
Under Robert Kennedy, successful prosecutions of organized crime figures increased 700%.